Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. So welcome to the first of our official video lectures for the course. We're going in a kind of back and forth pattern with the video lectures on Wednesdays and the actual meetings on Mondays. But both Mondays and Wednesdays, have a similar feel in that um, we're learning from a new chapter of the book. So it'll be an interesting, sort of format to follow here. But these video lectures, you can watch them at your own leisure and, you can go back. Now, ideally with the recordings of the Zoom meetings, you can do that too. But this is, a little more flexible in when they actually take place. So welcome to our first Zoom lecture for the course. So, the first part of our class, we're talking a lot about the medieval world, and we're continuing that now. And of course, we mean specifically medieval Europe. That's a sort of time period in European history and the history of a certain kind of train of thought, I guess you could say, that some people might call Western, but bear in mind that a lot of it is also connected to places like the East, like the caliphates as well. But we talked a lot last time about what were things like in medieval Europe and how was that a change from the Roman Empire. And we talked about how things were somewhat different outside of that northwestern Europe area. We had the Byzantine Empire, which was maintaining its traditions still pretty similarly to the Roman Empire, even though they weren't as strong or as powerful. And then we had the Caliphate, which was arguably very strong and powerful, and had quite a spread across Africa and Spain and the places we now think of as the Middle East. So yeah, so outside of Europe, things were pretty different. And later on, we're going to get into China, and China doesn't even know that Europe is going through any kind of Middle Age or even any sort of crisis or anything like that. China is having its own sort of period of growth. Whereas traditionally the Middle Ages has been seen as a time of less economic growth. But I'm going to talk about some stuff today that kind of complicates that picture a little bit. But we talked about how, economic stuff and intellectual culture maybe didn't survive as much, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of life was any worse for people in the Middle Ages. And in some cases, it might have been better. But what I didn't talk about last time was the institution of feudalism, and that's an important part of the picture. So I want to make sure we talk about that. So without further ado, let's dig right into it, this institution that defined medieval life in so many ways. So let me introduce you to the feudal system. Now it looks complicated. I'm gonna explain it so that it makes sense. So basically, in the feudal system, there are three tiers. The kings or lords, they're the knights or the nobles, and they're the serfs or the peasants. Now you might have heard a lot about knights in shining armor during the medieval period. Knights are a big part of what our concept of the medieval world is. But one thing that I think maybe modern pop culture isn't as aware of is what kind of person becomes a knight? Who are the knights in this equation? What kind of role do they play in the social world? Well, the role they actually play is a pretty upper class one. They are an aristocracy. They are sort of an elite compared to the mass of people, which is 90% peasants, poor workers, also known as serfs. And at the very top, you may have some kings who command the loyalty of the knights. Now, this is maybe not what we expect. We would expect maybe knights was an ordinary thing. But if you think about the kind of resources required to be a knight, you have to have armor and you have to have a horse. And you have to take care of both of those things. You're also probably going to have a sword, maybe a lance as well, some different weapons that peasants don't have access to. So the knights, just by merit of being these special kind of elite warriors, have to be elite members of society. They are on the upper class because they can afford all these things. But that is kind of key to their image. And their image of themselves is as these noble warriors, almost these heroic figures who are very oftentimes working for a king who is higher than them. So let me explain the links in this chain. That is the first link, the link between the king and the knight. Sometimes just another very powerful aristocrat, a lord. So the link between the lord or the king and the knight is based on this idea of warrior loyalty. So the king will have these knights who are known as vassals. A vassal is someone who promises to fight for the king. And he does this. It's usually, and I think throughout the whole Middle Ages, I can think of very few examples where there's a female knight. But the knight will swear fealty to his king. So here's one image of that fealty, his promise of loyalty. This is a famous knight of Roland, knight Roland, who is the knight of Charlemagne. So there were many stories told about Charlemagne, some of them real, some of them decidedly less real. But this sort of idea of the loyal knight Roland was a big part of that whole story. And so you make this promise of loyalty to your king. You promise it with the idea that God will punish you and send you to hell if you break your oath. Which is a pretty big deal. That's who you swear an oath to usually in this time period is to God, and the punishment is usually understood to be hell if you break the oath. That said, some people thought that were able to avoid the oaths. It was just a big deal when they broke the oaths. So that's worth bearing in mind. But to have a vassal is a very useful thing because now you have all these loyal knights who are fighting for you. So if the king wants to go to war, he knows that all these vassals will come along with him, and he will have these knights in shining armor leading the way. Maybe the archetypal model for this is King Arthur. You've got the king, and then you've got Sir Lancelot and all the other knights who are fighting for him. But what does the vassal get out of it? What does the knight get out of it? Well, the lord or the king provides land to the vassal. And this is a unit of land known as a fief. This is the sort of gift of land or trade for land. And so when the knight gives his loyal service, the knight gets to be the lord of a big bunch of land. He gets to build his mansion on it and, have a whole bunch of servants working for him and in general, have a good life. Possibly he may even have some sort of castle. We'll talk about castles in a bit. It's quite likely that he will be holding a castle. On the other hand, it's also possible that he just goes and joins some other knights to defend the king's castle. So both of those things can be the case. But the knight has all this land. He's living the good life. And what does he do with this land? Well, he basically rents it out like a landlord. And although a very special kind of landlord, he rents it out to peasants. And the peasants are bound all life long. So this is a unique kind of apartment renting. The peasants are bound their whole lives long to stay on the same land and work the same land. And they will work the land for the lords, well, for the nobles, for the knights, for whoever has the land. They work on the manor of the knight who has, wants to have lots of good food and good stuff. And so they might work on the farms, growing food, or they might be servants in the knight's household. And so that's what the knight gets out of this arrangement with the peasants. And that's why we see so much about peasants, because in this society, it was considered, at least most of the time, you were not supposed to, if you started off as a peasant, you were supposed to stay that way. Now, in practice, things could change around a lot, and we'll see some ideas about how things could shift. But for a lot of people, they were born a peasant, and then they might have a little more land or a little less land by the time that they died and passed it on to their kids, but they were still a peasant. And they were not supposed to leave that land without the noble's permission. The noble lord or landlord could, even drag them back if they ran away from the land. But the peasants did get something out of this, which was that the nobles would provide them military protection. If they were invaded by another king or another set of knights, the knights would round everybody up, get them into an army, and then keep the enemy army from destroying their crops. So in a way, you could almost think of it as a protection racket. The knights are protecting the peasants' land, at least in theory. Of course, that also means that the peasants have to sign up to join the army. And the vast bulk of the army is what's known as levies, peasants who have been conscripted, like the draft, into the knight's army. They don't really get a say in the matter. It's pretty much always men in some time periods where they need women, maybe, but most of the time it's the men go off. And oftentimes the women are left to work the farm. So peasant women do a lot of really hard work and work on the farms almost as much as the men do. So here we had a system where, if you're a peasant, and that's 90% of everybody, you're not free per se. Um, Now that said, there were some people who did have small farms who were free and were allowed to leave the land, making this more complicated. But for the most part, the peasants were not allowed to leave their land. So they're not free, but they're not exactly slaves either. And so one of the big questions, debates in medieval history is, where did the institution of Roman slavery go? Did it like transform into this over time? Or did or did it just disappear and then it was replaced by this slavery? Historians are pretty sure that the whole system of the knights being loyal to their kings, that has a lot to do with Germanic culture. And we see it in stories like Beowulf, with this great warrior Beowulf who fights for a king, being a warrior who's loyal to the king. And eventually the warriors start putting on shiny metal armor. So this is the sort of neatest model of the system. We having the three tiers, the top, the upper class, and the lower class. But it actually can get a little bit more complicated than that. Because if you think about it, we really have two things here. We have an institution of being a knight who's loyal to a king, and being a serf who grows food and gives a lot of it to a knight. And lives on the land of a knight. So those are kind of two different systems here. And in these days, historians have kind of moved away from seeing this as a very strict system and into sort of emphasizing the different parts. For instance, you can have a vassal who has another vassal in turn. So you could have a system where there's a king, and then the king has all these knights who are loyal vassals of his, but each of those knights has a loyal vassal to him. So in practice, the king has like 49 people or something like that. If the king has 7 knights and the knights have 7 vassals of their own, then you have a system like that. And the knight might own some land, and the knight's vassals might also own some land. So it could get pretty complicated. But the way this worked is that the kings would have these powerful warriors when he needed it. An important thing about the knights is that, unlike the peasants, they train all year round to be knights. So there's a pretty big difference between somebody who is a professional soldier, or a professional warrior, I guess you could say, who spends their time training for war constantly, versus someone who is just conscripted or drafted in. Countries and cultures that have professional armies generally tend to do better in battle than places that just draft people into their army. That was a big secret to the success of the Romans, for instance. So this is a good gig. And the knights have a lot of culture on this idea of them being heroes. I mean, there's all this knight in shining armor stuff. There's King Arthur's legends. So these aristocrats who are knights have a lot of culture to sort of remind them of how cool it is to be a knight. You see a lot of this in Game of Thrones, actually. In there, it's called bannermen. So the king has his bannermen. These, most historians would use the word vassals, basically serving the same function. Game of Thrones isn't 100% accurate on everything, but that is one of the areas where it's best, is saying the idea that, the king has his vassals, and we get to know some of the vassals along the way. Meanwhile, if we look at the bottom of the system, we can just talk about the idea of nobles giving land to the peasants. So we could have a king just give land to giving land to peasants, more like renting land. It's not a gift like the king gives to the knight. Renting land to peasants. We could have a king rent land to peasants directly. Surprisingly, you can also have like a religious institution rent land to peasants, like an abbey. Some abbeys own a lot of land. They own whole towns worth of land, making them very powerful. So despite their sort of pretense of being isolated from the world, these abbeys are kind of living the good life because they're getting a lot of food from peasants. And you might say that that's a necessity for them to be big, successful monasteries and abbeys. But that's just worth bearing in mind, that that's part of how it works. So basically, what we really have are two systems: the vassal system and the manorial system. The system of knights having manors and having poor peasants to work the manors. Now, sometimes you could get agreements with the guy who was your landlord, your noble, or knight. You could sometimes get him to agree to better terms. So sometimes things could go better for the peasants. It was just tricky. you had to kind of prove that the landlord had done you wrong. And he still had an awful lot of power and resources, and he wasn't farming all the time, which gave him a lot of free time. And in a similar way, the knights start getting more and more contracts with the kings, or the highest lords. They are able to sort of negotiate their feudal contracts, and say, oh, well, the king can't make me pay him this much money, or the king, can't make me go to war too many times, or, the king has to give me more land or something like that. Things like that. So that's sort of the logistics of this system. You got basically the three different groups, but there's a lot of freedom and flexibility within that system. And all of this is sort of describing things in a vacuum. And you've got to imagine that a lot of these knights were going to war with each other all the time. And so the territory was constantly changing. That's another thing. Just because you were both vassals of the same king didn't mean you couldn't go to war with each other. The king would just kind of shrug and be like, okay, you guys have fun, so long as you're not bothering me. And then he would call you back to fight in his war together, which must have been extremely awkward. But that's kind of some of the complexities there. And all this sort of applies to like the small towns and the knights who held castles, who that sort of watched over these small towns. It's a little bit more complicated when we get into the idea of cities. Now, cities are something that gradually developed over the whole course of the Middle Ages, over that whole 1,000-year period. A lot of towns started off as very small towns, but became very big towns by the end of that time period. For instance, in the 400s, London was just a trading post that the Romans had left behind. It was, most of the people in the surrounding area were not living in cities, and the Romans had built a fort and they built a small town, but that was about it. And they more or less had to abandon it. But over time, that small town, because it was at a good location, on a good river, connected to trade, stuff like that, that town grew into a very big and prosperous city by the end of the Middle Ages. So that's kind of the case for most of these small towns. They start off as small Germanic towns and grew into much bigger towns. And the major features of the towns would probably be the castle. We'll talk about castles again in a second. The market and the cathedral. Cathedral's a big deal, because you'll have people coming for religious reasons to visit your town. And more people started building cathedrals because they wanted to sort of bring people in, especially as time went on. But maybe more important is the market. So the market, is a big outdoor sort of open space where you can buy and sell goods. And what these cities would do is, like every year or maybe a couple times a year, they would have these great fairs where people would come to their market because that was the time to sell your stuff. So all across the land, they would sell, wood or grain or wool. Wool was a big one. There were a lot of people who were sort of wool sellers. They would buy wool from the peasants who got off the sheep, and then they would sell it, or they would, manufacture things with it, beautiful clothes. That was kind of one of the better options for you at that time period for warm clothes, was wool. And so they would dye it and they would make it into clothes, and then they would sell it back to people, mostly to, the people who could afford it. So some cities got very rich on this wool trade. And it's interesting that we see like a middleman coming in for the first time. This person doesn't, they don't shear the sheep, and sometimes they don't even manufacture the wool. Sometimes they just sell it to people who are going to manufacture the wool. And so these people who are more involved in buying and selling than they are in growing and shearing, these are the middle class. So on top of this sort of other classes, we've also got a growing middle class. Now it's pretty small, probably still less people in the middle class than in the peasant class. But these middle class become increasingly important, and there are more and more of them over time. It's in part thanks to them that we see the institution of guilds emerging, people who would sort of make an alliance to be professional, like shoemakers or wood carvers or stonemasons or things like that. a lot of the people doing that were sort of lower class, but it was a way to work your way up in a lot of ways. You could become a professional stonemason through this guild that would teach you the proper techniques. And the financial resources of the middle class kind of helped people spend the time on learning advanced techniques. And that's the kind of people who did things like build cathedrals, would be these professional stonemasons. So guilds were very important. This is also part of the world where a lot of sort of the festivities of medieval life would take place. For instance, medieval drama. You would have pageants about good and evil. You would have these very simple but straightforward plays that were acted out on a stage, and usually it would be a retelling of biblical stories. We got to remember that people aren't reading the Bible super much because only priests are able to do that because it's in Latin. So this is one of the ways that that knowledge of what the stories are goes to the public. And it's also just, fun to see. So it's interesting that, people weren't afraid to put on a costume and pretend to be the devil if it was ultimately a story about the devil being defeated by Jesus. So that's a little picture of the medieval towns. And, we have a tendency to say, like, things were bad in, things were economically not very successful with the fall of the Roman Empire, and, they didn't have as much trade and stuff like that. But one thing I would point out is that in the Roman period, you had the big Roman cities, but in the Middle Ages, you have a completely different set of cities being important. Cities like London and Paris and so on, and Troyes, other ones that are a little bit more obscure today. So is the story really that, there was an economic crash after Rome, or was it simply that these cities had been very small to start with and they grew over time? A big part of the reason for the Renaissance, and in a lot of ways the Renaissance that we're going to talk about later, is a continuation of a lot of themes from the Middle Ages, just with more population. I think a big part of the reason for that Renaissance is that the population grew over time. So, Middle Ages, we should take that into account too, that things were on this sort of gradual upward trajectory. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't a lot of problems and that it wasn't awful to be caught up in one of the wars that were happening between the kings and the knights and whatnot. But, just bear that in mind. That might be a different way to think about it. Okay, so that's my little look at the structure of medieval society. Medieval towns throw a wrench into the whole works, but you've got kind of a lot of different things going on. But hopefully that gives you a picture of it. In the next video, I want to change tracks a little bit and talk about the Norse culture, and also related to the Norse culture, the Normans, who were a surprisingly big influence on everything. And that will finally allow us to get talking about castles. So I'll see you for that one.